There is a specific day from 11 years ago that I remember pretty well. I was a high school freshman at the time and out with my mom at an outdoor mall within our city. Don't know if this was during a school night or the weekend, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, we enter one of the clothing stores. While my mom looks at clothes, I take in the music playing inside the store and think it's really good actually. Very upbeat, the kind of music that just makes a person smile when listened to. So I thought to myself, I need to memorize some of these lyrics if I'm gonna look it up on YouTube later. So I did just that, and after my mom and I returned from the mall, I was able to pull it up. Countdown by Beyonce. One of my favorite songs from her to this day. It was also that same day I discovered a webcomic called Khaos Komix. Maybe. I genuinely don't know for sure. A very real possibility I'm mushing some memories together. But we're just gonna go with it because I feel like that is what happened. Khaos Komix might be the first queer webcomic I've ever read. It might even be my first webcomic altogether. Keyword though is might. Again, this was over 11 years ago, and I unfortunately didn't have the foresight to document every webcomic I've ever read, from then to now. Nonetheless, it was in that period of my life that I discovered the webcomic, and I haven't forgotten about it since. So I would like to talk about this webcomic, my thoughts, my feelings, and why I think it's a queer webcomic classic. Khaos Komix is a queer coming-of-age webcomic written and illustrated by Tab Kimpton. Tab himself started it back when he was a teenager in 2006, and after 8 main chapters and 4 not safe for work side stories, concluded in the beginning of 2013. 5 additional side stories were released after that, with the final one releasing in 2014. The comic itself was initially hosted on comics.comicgenesis.com before moving over to its own site, chaoscomics.com. The site would be the comic's home for years to come, and just looking at the pages on Internet Archive fills me with so much nostalgia. The interface, colors, the tabs for fan art and extra art. Do you guys remember that? I feel like a lot of webcomics during that era had those sections, and I always loved browsing through them. Just a bunch of art with the characters in cute or goofy scenarios. I mean, it's great. Unfortunately for the site, however, some technical difficulties during maintenance messed it up, so Tab opted to move the comic over to his newer site, discordcomics.com. Now you can read the entirety of Khaos Komix on Discord Comics, along with Tab's other webcomics, some of which I might even cover in future videos. I'll provide the link in the description below, but in case YouTube still doesn't allow me to post links, just search Discord Comics and it should be the first result on Google. So, what is Khaos Komix about? Well, again, it's a queer coming-of-age that follows the stories of 8 individuals: Steve Maddie, Mark Sheffield, Amber Jury, Nanase Oten, Nay for short, Alex Murphy, Murphs for short, Tom Blake, Charlie Truman, and Jamie Davies. Each person has their own story told from their perspective as they navigate, well, a lot of things really. Sexuality, gender, homophobia, transphobia, body issues, abuse, a lot goes on in this comic. But the biggest message ultimately is one of love and acceptance. Basically a bunch of chaos, which is pretty much the reason why Tab went with the name. Now, if all this piques your interest in reading the comic, stop the video, check it out, and come back when you're done, because I'm essentially gonna spoil what goes down. So yeah, please read it, it's very good in my opinion, and please make sure to read the content warnings before starting. If you're still here, however, we can get into the spoilers. You have been warned. Like I mentioned before, there are 8 main characters, each having their own story to tell. The first 2 stories revolve around Steve and Mark. You might be wondering, why am I lumping these 2 together instead of talking about them separately? Well, time will answer that question, but I think you can make an educated guess. Besides the lovely cover pages, the first page from both stories involves Steve and Mark introducing themselves and a current situation they're in, with Steve thinking about his best friend, while Mark wakes up in someone else's bed naked. Certainly interesting ways to start the story for sure. To understand how these 2 got to where they are, however, I'm gonna have to jump back to the past. Steve first met Mark and Jamie when he arrived at a new school, and the 3 have become best friends ever since. On first impression, these 3 have fairly contrasting personalities. Mark, for one, is a super affectionate and cheerful guy that loves hugs. There is some backstory about him not being able to see his parents much, due to them both being busy with work, so I have to wonder if his almost clingy nature is kind of his way of compensating for the lack of attention his parents give him. But I could also be reading way too much into it. He's also pretty unfazed with the idea of being gay, as he witnessed his older brother sneak guys into his room to have sex with Mark hearing everything the next room over. Regardless, Mark just seems like a good time, and someone I would have loved as a friend growing up. Jamie, on the other hand, where should I start with this one? Jamie, I would say, is kind of Mark's opposite. He's very aggressive, cusses a lot, and is openly homophobic. Just ask Murphs, who is often on the receiving end of Jamie's insults, being called fag whenever they encounter each other at school. This harassment from Jamie would only get worse when he picks up on Mark being friendly towards him, hating on Murphs even more as a result. This would end up ruining Mark's chances with Murphs, as Mark actually had a crush on him, his first gay crush for that matter. So yeah, not a good first impression. But to be fair, he does seem to have a softer side. He's a good friend to Steve and Mark, is willing to have Steve's little sister Kimmy play with his hair after giving her best pouting face, and likes to draw. Doesn't really excuse the homophobia, but it's something, I guess. And finally, we have Steve, who honestly seems the most normal. He's just a pretty nice guy who loves his friends. His parents are also nice people. His dad teaches PE at school, much to Steve's embarrassment, and his mom loves cooking, even taking Mark and Jamie under her wing and helping her with cooking along with Steve. Mark and Jamie usually end up at Steve's place, either baking or playing basketball. Suffice to say, Steve is a pretty cool dude. And side note, but I just love when we get chibi moments with the characters. It's really cute. I was gonna go on a slight tangent about the influence of an anime-like art style in certain Western webcomics, especially during this era of early to mid-2000s webcomics, but besides the chibi moments, I think Khaos Komix has its own unique art style. I don't think it borrows too heavily from anime in my opinion. Anyways, that's neither here nor there, so back to the story. Sometime later, Mark's older brother is kicked out of the house after a fight with his parents about not wanting to return back to college. This devastates Mark as he loved his older brother. In his moment of weakness, however, Steve and Jamie comforted their friend. Steve especially, giving Mark the physical contact he needed. It was also at this time, however, that Mark started to catch feelings for Steve, becoming his second gay crush. Steve, meanwhile, didn't mind Mark's constant need for contact, and the two grew closer as a result. It wouldn't be until Steve's dad, bluntly if I may add, asks if he and Mark are having sex where Steve begins to actually consider what it means to be gay. Because up until that point, Steve only really knew the word as an insult thanks to Jamie. But surprise, surprise, some people actually could be gay. That same week, Steve paid attention to Mark's behaviors and came to the conclusion that Mark was pretty gay. At least in a stereotypical sense. He just had the mannerisms, the vibe. You get the picture. And with Jamie being more preoccupied with his new part-time job, that left more time for just Steve and Mark to be together. Steve, wanting to know more about what being gay is like, decides to do some research on the family computer while his parents and sister are out shopping and, well, discovers gay porn. Suffice to say, Steve is very shook by this, but ultimately keeps on watching, realizing that he kind of likes it. As hilarious as this scene is, it also hits pretty close to home for me, as I remember having a similar experience when discovering gay porn for myself. Well, for me at least, it started with me watching straight porn, but only paying attention to the men, then gay porn afterwards. Anyways, thanks to this new revelation, Steve begins to see Mark in a different way, namely by staring at his ass some more. Yeah, at this point, Steve was beginning to come to terms with the fact that he likes guys. But this also causes him to worry, as Mark is his best friend, and he doesn't want to risk ruining that friendship over a little crush. So Steve tried to ignore those feelings and even started avoiding Mark a bit. Mark, meanwhile, took notice of Steve acting different and even began to worry that Steve knew about Mark's crush on him and is acting distant because of it. Those worries, however, get dashed when Mark catches Steve looking at his ass, quickly putting the pieces together that Steve likes him. So they both clearly like each other. Only issue, however, is who would be the first to confess their feelings. Mark would rather give Steve the chance to confess first, but Steve is too shy about this sort of thing, so Mark instead poses the oh-so-brilliant idea of them both getting drunk with vodka at Mark's place while his parents are out of town. Mark's reasoning behind this is to drop Steve's guard so that when they're both drunk, they can have an easier time confessing to each other and even share a few kisses. I hope you managed to catch the sarcasm in my voice by calling this idea brilliant, because it is anything but. It is actually a terrible idea. What is stopping Mark from confessing to Steve while sober? I doubt Steve is gonna run off after that. If anything, Steve would be relieved that the feeling is mutual and doesn't have to worry about their friendship being ruined. It just feels like such an unnecessary step where things could quickly spiral out of control and... anyways. So in the end, they both get drunk, Mark kisses Steve and offers to do it, and the next thing you know, Mark is on top of Steve, trying to put it in. No lube beforehand or anything, and Mark is faced with the consequences of his own actions. Steve, seeing Mark uncomfortable despite trying to have sex, calls off the sex in favor of just chilling in bed, assuring Mark that he cares too much about him to see him in pain. And this means a lot to Mark, realizing that this is now more than a simple crush. A very sweet moment between the two. It doesn't last though, as come morning, Steve wakes up, freaks out, finds out that they did it, and freaks out some more. Steve, not remembering what happened that night and assuming he hurt Mark, claims that it was the vodka that had him acting weird, apologizing to Mark in the process. This actually makes Mark feel worse though, as now Mark is under the impression that Steve doesn't actually like him like that, and that the affection he showed Mark was from his drunken state. Suffice to say, the relationship between the boys is now strained, with the first crack in their friendship being Mark not telling Steve what really happened that night, too saddened from his heart breaking to clear up any misunderstandings. Okay, on the one hand, I kind of enjoy the messiness of it all. I do, I can't help it. I love the heartbreak, I love the misunderstandings. It gives the relationship stakes, you know? Adds some tension, not just on whether Steve and Mark will get together, but also if their friendship alone could survive this. It gets you invested, is what I'm trying to say. At the same time though, I'm just shaking my laptop, yelling at them to just talk to each other. Like we don't have to do this, we really don't. But here we are, and the show must go on. Mark, still recovering from his attempt to do it with Steve, walked on a limp the following 2 days. He also avoided Steve whenever he could. Steve, again feeling like he's at fault here, tries to make it up to Mark by spending more time with him, making his favorite foods, and constantly asking if he's okay. And well, this only makes Mark feel worse, and he blows up on Steve, fracturing their friendship even more. Jamie, in the dark on what really happened, but still noticing the divide between Steve and Mark, poses his own solution, getting Mark a girlfriend to take his mind off things. But who? Enter Amber Jury, a pretty, smart, funny girl that's also friends with Murphs. Steve thinks it's a great idea, as this could finally wash away his feelings for Mark. If Mark is unavailable, then surely Steve can move on, right? Surely those dreams he's been having of Mark will go away, right? Surely it's that simple, right? Oh, Steve, if only it was that easy. But hey, Mark actually goes for it when suggested by Steve and asks Amber out. And despite being surprised by this, Amber accepts. At first, Mark was motivated to make Steve jealous by being the perfect boyfriend to Amber, carrying her books, holding hands, all that gentlemanly stuff. As the weeks went by, however, Mark began to genuinely like Amber as a person. She just seemed pretty cool. Plus, Mark's parents were absolutely ecstatic over the news, always raving about her before and now planning to invite her to dinner. On the night Amber came over, she and Mark played video games in his room, absolutely destroying him in the process. Mark throws a fit at losing, but all of a sudden, Amber kisses him. Using Mark's own words here, the kiss was hard and furious. What started out as a relationship motivated by making Steve jealous ended up turning into something really sweet. Mark felt like he could be happy with Amber, cutting his losses with Steve and moving on. Right? Well, it's not that simple. Sure, Mark is happy being with Amber, but he also misses his friends. As it turns out though, Amber feels the same way, also feeling like she's been neglecting her friend, a girl named Danae. Amber missed Danae, and Mark missed Steve, so what was the solution? A double date, with Steve being Danae's date. Steve isn't the most thrilled at this idea, but feeling like he owes it to Mark, he accepts. After some adorable scenes of Steve's parents getting him ready for his date, as well as the dad giving Steve a condom, you know, just in case. Steve is off and arrives at the cinema. The girls opt to watch X-Men cause explosions equal cool, and we get them all watching a movie. Okay, I actually want to pause for a second here. So, like I mentioned before, I've been covering Steve and Mark's stories together, as it honestly just made sense to. There's a lot of overlap between events, and in both stories, their relationship to one another is the focal point. However, if there's one example thus far that best illustrates the idea of perspective, it would happen to be this scene right here. From Steve's perspective, he thinks Mark and Amber are perfect for each other, with them smiling and chatting to each other. And yeah, sure, that does happen. But when we get to Mark's perspective, we see a completely different story, a conflicted one, with Mark trying to focus on Amber, but ultimately finding himself thinking about Steve. It's moments like these where I think these stories really shine, as it recontextualizes events previously seen from one perspective and allows us to get a fuller picture of what's really going on. I don't know, I just think it's neat. Plus, this page right here is probably one of my favorites in the comic so far. I just think it's illustrated so beautifully, something about Amber and Steve's neutral expressions while they watch the movie, and the contrast between them and the black backgrounds just feels so aesthetically pleasing. Also, the contrast between them and Mark's more conflicted, flustered expression really ties the whole page together. So yeah, one of my favorite pages for sure. Okay, back to the story. We find out from Mark that he and Amber talked about having sex at her place after the double date ends. Due to Mark's lingering attachment to Steve, however, he realizes that he can't go through with it. He'd be lying to Amber, lying to Steve, and lying to himself for that matter. And that wouldn't be fair to anyone involved. Sometime later, we see Steve and Mark talking in the restroom after relieving themselves. Mark, unable to come clean to Steve about his feelings for him, instead brings up going back to Amber's place after this, with the implication of them doing it being made obvious to Steve. Mark asks Steve if he should go through with it. Mark internally wants Steve to push back on this, to tell him no, don't do this. But Steve has his own dilemma playing in his mind, still unable to admit that he likes Mark a lot. Ultimately, Mark shares a lot of good qualities about Amber, and Steve tells him to go for it. Just a mutual self-sabotage on both sides is just... it's hard to see. Nonetheless, the two share one final hug together and go their separate ways, both convinced that the other doesn't truly want them. Mark leaves with Amber, and Steve quickly thanks Nay before zooming out of there. Aw, poor Nay. Girl barely got a word in. After returning home, Steve makes it pretty clear to his parents that he's not in the mood to talk and goes straight to his room. And just like that, we finally arrive at Steve's present, with him laying on his bed, wondering about what Mark is doing with Amber right now. If I was covering Steve's story separately, this would be quite the cliffhanger to end on. But luckily, we still have the rest of Mark's story to get through, so let's get to it. So, Mark finds himself back at Amber's place, kissing Amber while imagining Steve doing it instead. And lo and behold, Amber actually clocks that. She knows that Mark is thinking about Steve, much to Mark's panic. And honestly, you better work, bitch. That was so cunt.
That was so cunt.
And how she's just calm about everything is just... yeah, I kind of got my life in this scene, as you can tell. Again, Mark panics over this and tries to deny it, but Amber doesn't mind. In fact, Amber has been observing how Mark and Steve look at each other. It looks like neither of them were subtle with their glimpses of one another. What Amber is confused on, however, is why Mark and Steve aren't together despite the mutual attraction. And so Mark explains everything, even the embarrassing bits. Amber then gives some pretty reasonable advice here, telling Mark to come clean and really just, well, talk to Steve. Like sometimes it's as simple as that, talking and clearing up misunderstandings. But to Mark's defense, maybe something as obvious as that doesn't really become obvious until someone else says it straight to your face. Sometimes you just need a friend to set you straight, or gay in this case, and say what needs to be said. And in this case, that friend is Amber. Mark does have a question though. Why didn't Amber tell him all this before? Well, Amber wanted Mark to realize his feelings for Steve on his own, and then Amber would help him out. Thing is, Mark was too in his head to admit to liking Steve, so Amber thought sex might be the solution as Mark would surely refuse that. Only he didn't, which meant that Amber had no choice but to stop, as she didn't really want to have sex. Double twist, Amber never really liked Mark like that. But she does fancy someone who reminds her of Mark. I wonder who that could be. And so, Mark leaves Amber's place, now with a better head on his shoulders. Mark is now confident enough to talk to Steve and admit everything. One problem though, Steve didn't come to class the next day. Or the next. Steve's dad actually approaches Mark about this and says that Steve has been in his room ever since the double date, refusing to get out or talk to anyone. And since Mark was one of the last to see Steve, Steve's dad thought Mark might know something. And know something Mark does, as the startling realization of Steve thinking Amber and Mark had sex begins to set in. Mark, horrified by this, quickly rushes out of school, leaving a confused dad, and runs all the way to Steve's house. Steve's mom answers, a bit confused on why Mark's here, and Mark zooms past her, determined to see Steve. Running up the stairs and opening his door, Mark finally reaches Steve. With just a towel on. Mark explains what Steve's dad told him, hence the need to check in on Steve. Steve replies that he needed a shower to clear his head and asks Mark to get out so he can get dressed. Mark obliges, and the two begin to talk through the door, starting with Mark admitting that he didn't have sex with Amber and that they're no longer together. And after Steve expresses his shock, Mark finally does it. He confesses to Steve. Oh, how I've been waiting for this moment. And what makes this moment even better is with Steve's mom eavesdropping on the conversation. I love it. Mark goes on to say that he liked Steve for a long time and even brings up when they got drunk, admitting that he actually remembered what happened and setting the record straight that Steve didn't hurt him. And concerning Amber, well, as much as Mark tried, he couldn't like her cause Amber isn't Steve. Mark likes Steve a lot, and even if Steve doesn't return those feelings, Mark just wants to say it, to admit that he really, really likes Steve. And lucky for Mark, cause Steve likes him right back. Mark takes off the glasses, they kiss, cue the door slam, and the next thing you know, Mark wakes up in Steve's bed, naked. Ah, now we know whose bed Mark woke up in all those pages later, bringing us to the present. Steve comes back with some food, They kiss again, and Steve brings up his mom, wanting to know if Mark plans to stay for tea. Mark wonders if Steve's mom heard them earlier, but Steve reassures him that his parents are cool with it and thought they were having sex weeks ago. Oh goodness. Mark feels nervous at the idea of telling his parents, but Steve is there to comfort him and tell him that everything will be okay, and they share one more kiss. Oh, and Mark's story ends with wondering what to tell Jamie. Yeah, we still have that loose thread to deal with, unfortunately. But wait, there's actually more. Enter the 18+ side story. I'm not gonna get into this much, just know that they have sex. In the timeline, this happens between Steve and Mark making out and Mark waking up in Steve's bed, if you were curious. Oh, and Chekhov's condom makes its grand reappearance. What I will mention, however, is how Steve's parents react. They hear pretty much everything and, oh man, they are doing their best to be supportive parents, okay? Good for them. By the way, thank you to commenter Garfield for pointing out the song Steve's mom is listening to. I checked it out and kind of like it. And that was Steve and Mark's story. Man, it's so nice reading this webcomic again. It just fills me with such a happy, warm feeling. Now, we still have 3 more parts to get to. Well, actually maybe 4 now that I think about it. So I don't want to immediately jump into why these stories mean so much to me till after I went through the whole series. As someone that read this when I was a teenager and closeted, however, it doesn't take much to understand why I love this webcomic so much. Okay, I think I'll close it here. I honestly expected to cover this entire webcomic in under an hour, but we all know that's not happening. And I'm so conflicted because on the one hand I'm like, you do not need to make these videos so long. But on the other hand, I can't help it. I want to talk about the story in detail. I want to mention the little things that make me happy. And if that means basically going through the story page by page, then so be it, I guess. Oh man. I guess I'm sticking to my guns with my especially lengthy recap style. But this time I am segmenting it into parts, so hopefully the videos aren't too overwhelming in length. Okay, I'm done for real. Thank you for watching, and before you head out, don't forget to wipe that icing off your face.